On a sunny March day in 1432, in the royal palace at Edirne, Huma Hatun, one of the wives of Murat II, gave birth to a boy. Murat II, learning about the birth of his new son, decided to give the baby boy the name of his father, Mehmed. Even though the birth of Mehmed saw the capital of Edirne celebrate in joy, no one, even Murat II, thought the young boy would ever become the next Ottoman Sultan. Mehmet was the youngest out of Murad's three sons. Murad's eldest son Ahmed was 12 and his second eldest son Alaaddin was 6. Although the Ottoman throne was not guaranteed to the oldest member of the imperial dynasty, Ahmed and Alaaddin clearly had a head start in the Ottoman Game of Thrones. As with all Ottoman Shahzadehs, Mehmed was given the best education by the leading scholars of the Islamic world. However, the young Mehmed was a naughty and energetic kid who had very little interest in learning, and he would often verbally threaten his teachers as he was the son of the Grand Ottoman Sultan. It was only after a choreographed slap to the face from one of the scholars onto Sultan Murat II that brought the shocked Mehmed into taking his classes seriously. Mehmed would go on to learn Arabic, Persian, Latin, Greek, and Italian, while also receiving a full Islamic education. By the time Mehmed was 5, his world had turned upside down as his mother Huma Hatun was sent away from the royal palace, and his eldest brother Shahzada Ahmed had died. Mara Brankovic, the Serbian royal, and the new wife of Murat II would become close with Mehmed after these traumatic events, and would act as the mother figure for the young boy for the rest of his life. The 1440s were a chaotic time period for the Ottoman state as Crusader armies from Europe posed a real threat to Ottoman rule in the Balkans. Murat II fought in Europe while his heir Shahzada Alaaddin fought against the Karamans in Anatolia. The Karamans had found the recent Crusader invasion an opportunity to raid into Ottoman lands in Anatolia, and they had even opened negotiations to ally with the Crusaders against the Ottomans. The Ottomans launched a series of military campaigns in Anatolia against the Karamans as a reaction to these events. It was after one of these Anatolia military campaigns in 1443, which would see Shahzada Alaaddin suddenly die at the age of 18, leaving Mehmed as the sole heir to the Ottoman Empire. As a way to prepare his inexperienced 11-year-old son, Murat II sent Mehmed to govern the city of Manisa in Anatolia. The practice of sending Shahzadehs to the provinces of the empire in order to train them in state affairs had its origins all the way back to the creation of the Ottoman state, and Mehmed was following the footsteps of many other Shahzadehs before him. By the year 1444, Murat II had secured peace in Europe against the Crusaders, and Mehmed was called back to Edirne as Murad planned on going into retirement. Murat II became the first Ottoman Sultan to abdicate his throne, and Mehmed became the youngest Ottoman Sultan to ever ascend to the throne up to that point in Ottoman history. In my previous Ottoman Sultans video about Murat II, I talked about Mehmed II's first reign as Sultan during the years 1444 and 1446, and so if you want a full refresher, go to the timestamps listed on the screen right now for that video. But here's a short summary of the events. Almost immediately after Mehmed's ascension to the Ottoman throne, the Crusaders broke the peace treaty that they had signed with Murat II and proceeded to invade the Ottoman Empire once more. They believed that the young Mehmed's ascension to the Ottoman throne was a sign of Ottoman weakness, and so they took a leap of faith by breaking the peace treaty in order to kick the Ottomans from Europe for once and for all. In this huge panic, Murat II was called back by Mehmed II to command the Ottoman army, which saw Murad defeat the Crusader army during the decisive Battle of Varna. During the aftermath of the battle, Murad returned back to retirement, but a Janissary mutiny and pressure from the Ottoman Grand Vizier Jandarlı Halid Pasha saw Murad once again become Sultan in 1446 at the expense of his son. Jandarlı Halid Pasha and his faction of Pashas thought the empire needed the strong leadership and martial talents of Murat II during these unprecedented times, so they opted to remove the inexperienced 14-year-old Mehmed from the throne. The years after 1446 saw Murat II continue to fend off further invading Crusader armies from Europe, beating them again during the Second Battle of Kosovo. However, the aging Murat II was not able to beat the Albanian warlord Skanderbeg during the siege of Cluj in 1450, and he would soon die afterwards in 1451 from a stroke. Meanwhile, Mehmed had been sent back, along with his trusted pashas, to Manisa after his dethronement. It was during these years in Manisa that Mehmed yearned to take back his place as the Ottoman Sultan, as he thought he was unfairly dethroned by the schemes of Grand Vizier Candurli Halid Pasha. Anyhow, during the start of 1451, the news of Murat II's death from Edirne had reached the now 19-year-old Mehmed. As soon as Mehmed heard the news of his father's death, he quickly rushed to the capital of Edirne to secure his throne before any other claimants to the Ottoman throne could take action. There were only two other claimants to the throne other than Mehmed, and they were Hasan Çelebi, the 1-year-old son of Murat II, and Orhan Çelebi, the grandson of Süleyman Çelebi from the Ottoman interregnum. Orhan Çelebi had been a thorn to Murat II, as he wished to regain the Ottoman throne that his grandfather lost during the Ottoman interregnum by working with the Byzantines. The Ottoman prince constantly looked for opportunities to seize the Ottoman throne while Murat II was on military campaigns, but none of his exploits ever achieved to gather enough supporters in Edirne. In reality, the Byzantines used Orhan Çelebi as a bargaining chip in its diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, in which they demanded tribute for the captivity of the Ottoman prince. Nevertheless, the speedy Mehmed arrived in Edirne within a couple of days, thus securing the Ottoman throne for himself. The baby Hasan Çelebi was put to death a couple weeks later in order to ensure the future stability of the empire, and Orhan Çelebi continued his captivity in Constantinople after failing to secure sufficient support in Edirne. After becoming Sultan, Mehmed II, to the surprise of everyone, requested Candurli Halid Pasha to continue his current role as Grand Vizier. The relationship between the two men had started on the wrong foot, but the young Mehmed wanted to unify his cabinet before embarking on his grand plan. In the Islamic Hadith that was documented during the early days of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad talked about a future Islamic conquest of the grand Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. These words and teachings of his Islamic tutor, Aksham Sa'din, captivated the young Mehmed ever since he was a small child. Even though Constantinople was one of the most important cities in the world due to its history and strategical location, it had been largely reduced to a slum city by the time of Mehmed's reign. Whatever the condition of Constantinople was, Sultan Mehmed II believed that it was his destiny to conquer the mystical city that stood at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Grand Vizier Candurli Halid Pasha was more skeptical about Mehmed's ambitions of conquering Constantinople, as he was more aware of the type of destruction that the Ottoman state had gone through in the recent years. The many battles fought in the Balkans against the Crusaders and the Albanians had taken a toll on the empire's manpower and economy. Halid Pasha believed that it was not wise for Mehmed to besiege Constantinople so soon after the conclusion of these wars. The Ottomans had besieged Constantinople back in the 1390s and even during the reign of Murat II in 1422, but all attempts to capture the city failed at the expense of immense Ottoman resources. Halid Pasha knew the immense strength of Constantinople's fortifications and wished not to attract any more Crusader armies from Europe by besieging the city. Halid Pasha instead wanted Mehmed to focus on the resources of the state to strengthen Ottoman positions in the Balkans. Halid Pasha thought the rash decisions of an unproven sultan like Mehmed II could lead the Ottomans to disaster, while Mehmed II himself believed that the conquest of Constantinople was paramount for any future Ottoman successes. The conquest of the city would connect the two halves of the empire, in which the Ottoman army could be easily transferred back and forth from Asia and Europe. In addition to that, the conquest of the city would also eliminate Byzantine threats of starting an Ottoman civil war during times of Ottoman uncertainty. Sultan Mehmed's point was proven right, as days after his ascension to the throne, the Byzantines had demanded an increase in tribute for Orhan Çelebi. The Byzantine demand was quickly rejected, and Mehmed started his preparations for the upcoming siege. New large cannons were produced by the Hungarian engineer Orban, and the Rumelian castle was built off the coast of the Bosphorus in order to blockade Constantinople from the Black Sea. Mehmed would also go on his first military campaign during this time period against the Karamans to force them into submission before his planned upcoming siege. The 19-year-old Mehmed quickly won his first military campaign, in which he commanded his troops into battle for the first time as a sultan. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI probably realized that he had chewed more than he could swallow when he provoked Mehmed earlier that year. All Byzantine peace offers were swiftly rejected by Mehmed, as he was openly preparing his army for war. The next 2 years would see Mehmed heavily prepare for the siege of Constantinople, which resulted in Constantine XI seeking to get military aid from Europe. Only a small attachment of Genoese mercenaries would ever come to the aid of the Byzantine Emperor. After 2 years of preparations, on April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army under Sultan Mehmed II and his pashas Halil Pasha and Zaganos Pasha surrounded the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. The siege of Constantinople had just begun. The preceding 53-day siege was a bloody affair for both sides, which resulted in heavy casualties for both the Byzantines and the Ottomans. Dozens of Ottoman attacks on the Theodosian walls were repulsed, and after weeks of fighting, the Ottoman army was morally depleted. To make things worse, supply ships from Europe had broken through the Ottoman naval blockade, which saw European ships sail into the protected and chained harbor of the Golden Horn, which supplied Constantinople with much-needed supplies for the siege. Halil Pasha advised Mehmed to lift the siege and save the Ottoman army from total destruction. However, Mehmed's military advisor, Zaganos Pasha, and his tutor, Aksham Sa'adin, motivated the Sultan to continue on with the siege. Sultan Mehmed II then thought of a military plan to break the deadlock of the siege. Ottoman warships were transported around the Genoese colony of Galata into the Golden Horn, which opened yet another military front for the depleted forces of the Byzantines. Mehmed II offered terms of peace to Constantine XI, promising the Byzantine Emperor safe passage to Greece and the safety of the citizens of Constantinople. The peace offer was rejected. After days of preparation, Mehmed ordered a final assault on Constantinople, hoping to overwhelm the forces of the Byzantines on the walls. Ottoman manpower and gunpowder proved too mighty for the Byzantines, which saw the Ottomans storm into Constantinople during the early hours of the 29th of May. During the final battle, Constantine XI fought to the very end with the remainder of his army, but to no avail. The last emperor of the Romans had died fighting for the city that had been the heart of the Roman world for over a century. The illustrious Byzantine Empire that could trace its history back to Constantine the Great and Julius Caesar was now dead. Shortly after the siege, Grand Vizier Jandula Halil Pasha was removed from power by Mehmed, as he and the Megas Dukes of the Byzantine Empire, Lokas Notaras, had conducted secret talks during the siege without the knowledge of their respective monarchs. Zaganos Pasha, the loyal companion of Sultan Mehmed II, would become the new Grand Vizier of the empire in the stead of Halil Pasha's downfall. Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had been an opponent to many of the decisions of Mehmed, would soon be executed, becoming the first Ottoman Grand Vizier to die in that matter. After 3 days of Ottoman soldiers looting the city, the 21-year-old Mehmed II entered Constantinople, proclaiming himself as the new Caesar of Rome. It is said that when Mehmed saw the city in ruins, he teared up and uttered the words, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction." The ruined city became the new Ottoman capital, and Hagia Sophia, the main Christian church of the city, was converted into a mosque soon after. The fall of Constantinople shocked many Europeans who viewed the fall of the city as a catastrophic event for Christendom. Many Europeans feared that their kingdoms would be next to fall to Mehmed's wrath. Meanwhile, back in the Ottoman Empire, the city of Constantinople would be reconstructed and repaired by Mehmed during the years after the siege, which saw the city return back to its former elegance that hadn't been seen since the golden age of the Byzantine Empire. The Topkapi Palace was also constructed in the decades after the conquest, which would serve as the living quarters for all Ottoman sultans until 1856, and would also serve as the home of the Imperial Ottoman Court. The rebirth of the city saw its population quadruple in size by the end of the century. Constantinople, under Ottoman rule, was once again the premier city of Europe after centuries of succumbing to decline. At the age of 21, Sultan Mehmed II had done what most monarchs couldn't do in a lifetime. Mehmed's new Rome was born. Sultan Mehmed II would spend the next 28 years fighting countless wars in Europe and Asia, which expanded the Ottoman Empire further than it had before the Battle of Ankara in 1402. By 1459, the Despotate of Serbia was fully annexed with the exception of Belgrade. The same year would see the Despotate of Morea being fully annexed by Mehmed due to the country refusing to pay its yearly tribute to the empire. The important Genoese fortress at Amasra on the Black Sea coast would also be conquered the next year. The Jandar Beylik and the Empire of Trabzon would also be annexed in 1461, thus ending the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire. In 1462, Mehmed would also invade and vassalize Wallachia after dethroning Vlad the Impaler from power. The same year would see the island of Lesbos being seized by Mehmed. Between 1463 and 1464, the Kingdom of Bosnia would be annexed into the Ottoman Empire. The Karaman Beylik was annexed in 1468. The Venetian colony of Negroponte was also conquered after a military campaign led by Mehmed in 1470. In 1473, Mehmed would defeat the White Sheep Turkmens during the Battle of Olukbili, which would mark the beginning of the end of the Turkmen Empire. In 1475, the Crimean Khanate would also be vassalized, and Genoese colonies in the region would be annexed by the Ottomans. In 1479, the Ottomans had won its war against Venice after 16 years of war, which would see Albania annexed into the empire. In 1480, the Ottomans began their invasion of Italy. Aside from Skanderbeg's resistance movement, the Siege of Belgrade in 1456, and the Battle of Vaslui in 1475, the reign of Mehmed II was filled with many countless Ottoman victories. The reign of Sultan Mehmed II saw the Ottoman Empire embrace its multicultural state, as Mehmed wished to create an Islamic-styled Roman Empire. Mehmed gathered Italian artists, humanists, and Greek scholars at his court and allowed the Byzantine Church to continue functioning as it did for centuries. In 1479, Mehmed had even hired the famous Italian painter Gentile Bellini to paint his portrait, which was unheard of for Islamic monarchs to do. Mehmed also collected in his palace a library of ancient Greek, Persian, and Latin works, including the histories of the Byzantine emperors that had preceded him. Ever since when he was a Shahzadeh, Mehmed also collected numerous Renaissance works from Europe, as he was an avid fan of classical literature. Sultan Mehmed II was truly a man of the Renaissance. However, Mehmed's interest in Western culture did not win him any conservative allies at court or the Islamic ulama, so many of the items from his collection were sold after his death. Mehmed was also a man of science in which he would fund the construction of many observatories and universities around the empire, with some even operational up to this day. Mehmed would also have Islamic astronomers like Ali Krishche and other mathematicians in his court in order to be updated on the latest developments in the scientific world. Mehmed II's reign also saw an increase in considerable degrees of religious freedom in the empire, which saw the creation of an early form of the millet system, which allowed non-Muslim communities to rule themselves under their own laws, provided if they were obedient to the Ottoman Sultan. The Ottoman state was also transformed during the reign of Mehmed II. Under previous administrations, the Ottoman court was filled with Turkish noble families that had sometimes had other interests and loyalties than that of the Sultan. Mehmed the Conqueror transitioned the empire away from the Turkic Gazi mentality that emphasizes ancient traditions and ceremonies in governance, and moved the empire towards a centralized bureaucracy, largely made out of officials from the Devshirme background from the Balkans. Sultan Mehmed II also started the process of codifying Ottoman criminal and constitutional law, something that his great-grandson Suleiman the Magnificent would complete. In 1481, the 49-year-old Sultan Mehmed II died en route to Constantinople with the Ottoman army on his side, preparing to either invade the island of Rhodes or reinforce his Italian invasion that had started the year before. Some Turkish historians even cite that Mehmed was making preparations to invade the Mamluks and claim the caliphate for the Ottoman Empire. Whatever the case was, all current and future Ottoman military campaigns were cancelled since Mehmed had failed to designate an heir between his sons, which caused a huge panic to erupt in the Ottoman administration. A civil war was looming over the horizon for the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the conqueror was buried at the mosque that he had commissioned after the conquest of Constantinople, where he lies to this very day. There are a few monarchs and military generals from world history who call themselves conquerors, but I believe that Sultan Mehmed II truly deserves this epithet. The reign of Mehmed the Conqueror is the time period when the Ottoman state transformed from being a local power in regional affairs to being the dominant force in world politics for the next 400 years. The golden age of the Ottoman Empire had just begun.
And so, we begin.